My two questions are about canonization's process and, of course, Sister Lucia. What is the status and why it's taking so long? Some people ask me, why does it take so long once the Blessed Mother said that she will take Lucia to heaven? So one thing very clear, when a process of canonization is nothing to do with the apparitions. Lucia will not be canonized because she saw Our Lady. This is just a fact in her life. What we want to see and look about Lucia's life is how she lived, like us, the baptismal vows until the fulfillment of Christ measure, okay? So we have to see her faith, her hope, her charity, all the virtues, the religious life, prayer life. Just because Our Lady said that means she was faithful. So the process of Lucia has nothing to do with her apparitions. Because I was vice postulator, I was also helping in the interrogatory for the testimonies for the process of canonization. And among the more than 150 questions, only 2 were about Fatima. Okay, so believe me, there is nothing, she will not be canonized because she saw Our Lady. So far, we finished the diocesan stage last year, 2017. That means that all the process that we recollect now is in Rome, so we are waiting for the Roman process. You have to think about the process of canonization really as a lawyer process. So we have to have documents and witnesses, okay? To testify that this woman became like Christ. So we have the written documents and the people who were with her. The people who lived with Sister Lucia mainly were the sisters, but nevertheless we interviewed 60 witnesses. 60 is a number that is comfortable for the congregation of the saints. The problem with Lucia cause, that's why it took us so long, it's that she wrote, okay, she could not speak about Fatima, she was not a preacher, but she wrote. And the problem was not what she wrote because she wanted. She did not write anything of her own will. What she wrote was under obedience. The Bishop of Leiria told her to write a diary, her diary, 2,000 pages. Told her to write the 4 books she published. It was because the bishop asked, or the spiritual director, or the provincial. So we have 4 books. So far, so good. The problem is, until 1970, we have no way to know, because all the letters she received, she destroyed in order to protect the person who wrote, okay? The problem is that after 1970, the superiors told Lucia to keep all the letters she received. So we know that until she died, 2005, from 1970, she received more than 70,000 letters. And the problem was, she answered. She answered almost all the letters. So, of course, in the last part of her life, just a card saying, Sister Lucia prayed for your intentions, with her signature, but we have thousands of letters. So we have to recollect all the letters, taking copy. So that became an amount of 15,000 pages that Lucia wrote. So every single page that she wrote, every single line, had to be read by 2 independent theologians, 2. So we are talking about 30,000 pages, to prove that she did not write anything against the Catholic teaching. So that took us a while. So far that is done. Everything went to Rome. Now we are in Rome, okay? With a bunch of 15,000 pages, and we have to squeeze that in a volume that they call Positio. The maximum has to be 800 pages. Yeah, it's like a summary of her life. So we are in this stage. We have to demonstrate, according to what she wrote, according the others saw about her, that she was, an heroic person in the virtues. So that is taking a long. I know you can tell me, and I'm finishing, can't we do it fast? Okay, you have to think about this. Sister Lucia, life, almost 1 century, crossed the most important figures of our Catholicism. Since since Pius XII, she wrote to all the popes, and the popes wrote to her. I'm talking Pius XII, John Paul Paul VI, John Paul II, John Paul I, we don't know. She met, or They were looking for her. 50 cardinals all around the world, bishops, then politicians. Remember the Cold War? She was a part of it. So the life of Lucia is not only the life of a simple cloister nun. It's the life of someone whose life and ministry touches the most important moments of the 20th century. And many of them are crucial. Many of them are complex. So it is important to study well the life of Lucia, to respect her dignity as a human person, and also to respect the message of Fatima that she was holding in her life. So it will take us a while, yes, but I think it's a good work that we do to the Church in itself, to Lucia as a person, and to the message of Fatima, to read carefully, go deeper. As you know, so many complex things are always around Fatima, right? So our mission now is try to make it clear the most we can. That's it.
How can you help very angry patients understand the concept of redemptive suffering? I am referring to patients who define themselves as devout Catholics. Can anger prevent patients from accepting the role of redemptive suffering? You know, it's maybe not that simple, because every human being has a different personality, and sometimes we have to go through stages of dying. If somebody is seriously ill, he may be upset with the whole thing. There's a book on the stages of dying, and one of the stages is anger as well. But on the other hand, there's also personalities who just kind of, they immediately react with passion. I think the number one is that probably the best way is to look at Christ himself, who suffered on our behalf, who embraced freely. I think meditating on the passion of Christ would probably be helpful. Praying for that person. It may take a long time. As you remember, Jesus gave us two examples of brothers. One who said to the father, he asked him to do something, and he said no, he was really upset, whatever you want to call it. I don't want to interpret the scripture, but he said no. And then, and the other one said yes, everything is. But the one who did not accept ultimately did what the father wished. And so when Jesus said, who did the better? The one who said yes, but didn't really care at the end, didn't do it. But the one who was objecting and maybe upset and whatever, he still did it. So I think the Lord can help us. I think by one is that asking God, just asking Him to help us to understand redemptive suffering, because it's not something that's easily, acceptable to us. I know quite a few people like that who are very angry that God is telling the wrong, set of cards to play with, and I know that it's not simple. However, God can do everything. So prayer, asking them to reflect on Christ's suffering for them, and and somehow sometimes being patient with them.
Please address this crisis of addiction and overdose death, and what does the Church teach concerning this? I'm going to try and answer this best I can, and then ask for Bishop and Father Mark's help. But Florida's been particularly hard hit. I live in Tampa, and the Attorney General's gotten involved, and they're trying to really regulate the opioids. And for years when I was in practice, nobody was keeping track of anything, so they're having a registry. And as physicians, I encourage you to, you don't need to write a Percocet number 60 for somebody who may need 2 or 3 pills. It's just practical. I read the other day in the Wall Street Journal where the drug companies had testified before Congress, and there were towns in West Virginia, maybe 1,500 people, like the little town I grew up in, Ohio, where they were shipping thousands and thousands of opioid pills. So there's many facets to this problem. I'll be talking about drug addictions in the message of divine mercy tomorrow, and relating the 12 steps to the message of divine mercy. One of the key things I keep popping up in my own spiritual life is that more and more this is all about love, and the answer is the same answer for non-addicts. It comes back to living a holy life. The sacraments are the source, and prayer. And in the 12-step program, of course, it addresses a higher power, and yet, as Scripture said, Jesus is the name above all names, and He's the ultimate higher power. The first 3 steps deal with our relationship with God. And counselors have told me that if you don't get the first 3 steps right, you're not going to get 4, 5, 6 through 12. So it all comes back to kind of getting things right with God. As far as death, there's a small booklet in the back, I believe it's there, at the bedside of the sick and dying. And I believe it's on page 55 where I pulled out one of the quotes out of the diary where St. Faustina talks about, at the moment of death, all is not lost. You may have a comatose patient, you may have a drug addict who's alone, and we think, oh, it's all over. But she speaks of how the Lord comes at that final instant and basically asks them if they want to come with Him, He who is love and mercy. So we never give up hope, we keep praying, and we leave it in the mercy of God. Mercy is His greatest attribute. And again, if you're involved in a situation like that, you have to be the reflection and the icon and the image of Jesus, and know that we just trust in God's mercy.
What lessons do we learn from Alfie and Charlie Gard? I think this question is especially appropriate. The circumstances under which these children were maintained on life-sustaining treatment, and the healthcare professionals really were very, very involved and loved these patients very, very much. I think that I would have to say, in context of our Catholic faith and of how we are trained to really pay attention to what the needs of not only the child is, but what are the needs of the family? And how can we witness to Christ under these circumstances? And even though the situation may look futile, I personally think that if that family, for little Alfie, wanted their baby to die at the Vatican, at the Baby Jesus Hospital, they should have that option. To me, I have to step back and say, okay, I don't think this could ever happen in the United States, and yet it has, with the 13-year-old girl with the tonsils, that the hospital declared her dead, and she wasn't. So I think as patient advocates, now speaking as a case manager, I would advocate very strongly that pastoral care would be involved, and that these children and their families be supported in what's best for them, and not the political or hospital situation. Bishop?
I would agree with what Mary said. My concern with that whole issue, both in Charlie and with Alfie, is the overarching interference of the government. And that is a major, major concern. All things being equal, I mean, the parents could have made the decision to remove the medical intervention from the babies. I mean, although apparently in Alfie's case, there was no really certain prognosis of the situation. They didn't know what the brain ailment was. But in the case where if in fact the child was dying and the intervention only prolonged the dying process, the parents could have made that decision. But I find it very troubling when the government interjects itself and says, we are the final arbitrators. It's not inconsistent where English society has gone over the years. But what is developed in Europe sometimes, the more progressive societies end up in our backyard. So it's something that has to be given some attention. I just have well, there are many, many questions here, but two that have to do with the technological interventions at the beginning of life. One is this: if the sperm from the husband is injected into the wife to have a baby, is that okay? And then in parentheses it says, was told by my parish priest, the Catholic Church has no specific teaching, to make my own conscious decision. Now you know I tell my priest to call me when they have this type of situation. Because the answer to is it is not okay. It's a type of artificial fertilization, obviously. But the thing is this: the church, Catholic moral theology is very highly nuanced. It makes clear distinctions. And one distinction in terms of medical technology at the beginning of life is that if the medical technology helps, assists in the successful completion of the married act, the actual intercourse between a man and a woman, if some type of intervention helps that to be successful in conceiving the child, then the assistance can be sought. However, if the medical technology replaces, either partially or completely, the married act, we have a moral problem. That's the basic distinction. The second related is about direct and indirect abortions. The question is, can you speak to the morality or immorality of the following? A baby is diagnosed in utero with a terminal condition. Is an abortion direct or indirect? In that same case, the baby dies in utero. Is an abortion direct or indirect? Well, the question is this: if the child is somehow diagnosed with a terminal condition, to directly end the child's life is a direct abortion. Cannot be justified by any circumstances. However, if in the process of trying to deal with the fatal disease in utero, if that medical intervention has the intention of trying to cure that pathology, but in the attempt to cure, if the baby dies, that would be an indirect abortion. So, but it has to do with intentionality. If my intention is to kill that child, even though that child is suffering from a fatal pathology, it's a direct abortion. If the child dies in utero, as a result of the pathology, obviously, it doesn't fall into the category of a direct or indirect abortion. Anyone have any questions?
Okay, so we have time for one more question. It's 12:01 and your stomachs are probably telling you that. So this is a hard question, but I'm going to take it, especially because I don't usually have a bishop sitting at my right hand. And I figure if I say something that's a little bit misleading, Bishop McManus can correct me. So here's the question. I'm just going to read it as it's written here. If a person out of ignorance has several abortions, the act of murder is still murder, and communion would be properly denied. The same for a nurse who, through mercy killing, kills patients, believing she is merciful to terminal pain and impending death in terminal patients. How is this different from those who engage in adultery ignorantly or not? How can they be excused of the grave nature of their sin when a murderer, however ignorant or quote-unquote merciful in intention? Murder is still murder, adultery remains adultery, right? Could I have a glass of water first? No. Okay. Let's just talk about the framework here and sort of bring it back to my talk. So we have the bishops of Buenos Aires, for example, writing to Pope Francis and saying that if you have a divorced and remarried couple, they should try to get an annulment. And then they go on and they say if an annulment cannot be obtained, then it is possible, at least in some cases, through pastoral accompaniment of that person, that they could still be admitted to Eucharistic communion. And so Pope Francis writes back to the Argentinian bishops and says that he is congratulatory towards them and says there are no other interpretations of chapter 8 of Amoris Laetitia. Now, people will then ask this kind of question, because they will say, if it is the case that a couple who is objectively in a state of adultery might not be guilty of mortal sin and can therefore receive communion, are we going to say the same thing about other grave evils like abortion? Like suppose you have an abortionist who's really struggling with the church's teaching, and he goes to confession and says, I'm really struggling with this teaching. could the priest say to himself, okay, abortion is gravely evil, but maybe he's not guilty of mortal sin, so I'll absolve him and give him communion on the way to the abortion clinic, right? See? So this is a very difficult question. Here's how I would answer it. There's at least two differences I can think of between the divorced and remarried situation and the abortion situation. One is simply the fact that we don't have thousands of abortionists who want to go to communion even while they're abortionists, right, and receive confession and communion. Whereas we do have thousands of divorced and remarried Catholics who kind of wonder where they stand in regard to the church, right? So the pastoral situation is just different, and that's why Pope Francis is reaching out to one group and not necessarily the other, okay? But the more important thing, I think, is this. One of the things that's necessary for mortal sin is deliberate consent, right? Now, in marriage, you have two people involved, and that can make the consent more thorny. So, for example, let's say you have a divorced and remarried couple. The wife has some kind of conversion and is willing to live as brother and sister, but the husband is not. Might that compromise her consent? Okay, I'm not sure what the answer to that question is, but it seems possible to me that at least for her, if she gives in, it might not be mortal sin, right? Or let's suppose you have a situation where you have divorce and remarriage, and the husband says to the wife, if you don't give me what I want, I'm leaving. I'm leaving you, and I'm leaving the children. Might that compromise her consent to where, although it would still be a gravely evil situation, she might not be guilty of mortal sin? Okay, again, I'm not sure what the answer to that question is, but it seems possible to me, okay? So I think there's a difference between those two kinds of situations, because the fact that there's two people involved in a marriage makes the consent question more difficult. Okay? I think that's the best I can do.
One thing we have to keep also in mind in these thorny questions is the reality of scandal. And by scandal, I don't mean someone telling an off-color joke and we get blood rushes to our face. By scandal, a theological scandal, which is to say that I do or say something that causes, I do or say something that is objectively wrong. That might cause someone else to think that it's right, that he or she can do that. That's theological scandal, and that's at the heart of many of the moral situations we face. And that's the thorny problem with this whole idea of giving community to divorced and remarried couples. That I think that the possibility of scandal, which is to say the church has changed her teaching in terms of the indissolubility of marriage and have to be objectively in the state of really in the state of grace in order to accept or to receive Holy Communion or to go to seek the grace of confession. Very complex situations, but I'm afraid that the practice will undercut the teaching of the church. So I think we have to be very, very careful. And my approach to this whole situation is this, that theologically a good principle to hold on to is this. When a teaching is presented in the church which seems to be ambiguous, then the ambiguity of the question has to be resolved by seeing it in the larger context of church teaching. So it seems to me the church teaching has been very clear. John Paul II from the Ars Consortio, Benedict XVI on the Eucharist, and then the Catechism of the Catholic Church. The teaching is very, very clear. So if there's ambiguity, as a pastor, I think, and as a bishop, my role is to counsel my priest to fall back on the traditional teaching of the church.
Okay, so that will conclude our panel discussion. And thank you very much, Bishop McManus. Again, our 13th year with the bishop here.